record it. There you go. Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. We're delighted to have a presentation with Dr. Janelle Lupke today. Dr. Lupke is an assistant professor with the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Nursing, and she's a colleague of mine. And I will pass it on to Dr. Lupke to further introduce yourself, and then we're excited for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Should I go ahead and share now?
Yep.
Okay. Just gotta move some stuff around so I can. Oh, I just admitted someone. All right. Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Janelle, and again, I'm an assistant professor and the director of the Native Lab at the UW-Madison School of Nursing. And the title of my talk today is called Reimagining Research for Planetary Health. And I'll be covering some of the frameworks that I use in my nursing research in Indigenous communities, such as Indigenous feminism, two-eyed seeing, and relational approaches to environmental justice. Oh, there we go. So I also introduce myself in my traditional way. So Buju, Giniwea, Ogamakwe, Nindijnakas, Ajijak, Nedudam Nada'a, Mashki Zibing, Nindujaba. So you also get a little bit of a language lesson here because it's translated into English. I'm an enrolled member of Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. As you can see, we call it Medicine River and not Bad River. Medicine River is what we had always called it prior to colonization, when the colonizers named it Bad River. And for us, we call it Medicine River because everything that we need to live and thrive and be well can be found within and along the banks of our river. So it's really important to state this positionality and to introduce myself in a traditional and a good way, because typically we don't begin with degrees or job titles. We begin from the place of who we are, where we come from, who we belong to, who we're accountable to. And positionality is also not something that's performative. It's a part of being accountable. And it also reminds us that knowledge is not disembodied, but rather that it's relational. So I just want to do a quick land acknowledgement from where I am here. So in Wisconsin, we have 12 sovereign nations, 11 of which are federally recognized. And where I live in Madison is on the ancestral homelands of the Ho-Chunk. And where I'm from is way up at the very tip top. You can see up where it says Bad River. I don't have a pointer. I'm pointing at my screen, but you can't see what I'm pointing at. But way up there by Lake Superior is where the Bad River Reservation is. And all those little white spots or squares on your screen are where all of the other tribes are located. And the little dots are the smaller reservations, but also the traditional lands of the Ho-Chunk, because they're the only tribe in Wisconsin that does not have reservation boundaries. But in Wisconsin, we also have a really robust urban Native population in larger cities such as Milwaukee, Green Bay, and Madison. In fact, about 65 to 70% of all our tribal members live in urban areas. So learning objectives for today, we'll be describing environmental and structural drivers of health inequities, particularly when it comes to gender-based violence among Indigenous women, explaining Indigenous frameworks for planetary health and research, and then identify strategies for nursing practice. So for planetary health and nursing, planetary health is really, it's focused on the interconnectedness of health of humans, other species, and the physical environment. It focuses on understanding and addressing the way human disruptions of Earth's natural systems that could be involving air, water, land, our water systems. And as nurses, I'm sure you've talked a lot about ways that nurses can play a central role in mitigating and adapting to current and future health threats from climate change, which we've been seeing more and more of lately. And this also leads to increased morbidity and mortality, premature death, and a lower quality of life. So this is something that I'm particularly involved with my own tribe. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with the Line 5 situation that's happening up north, but a lot of our current our tribal members, whether they're on the reservation or not, are highly vested in being involved in the Line 5 project because we have aging oil pipelines that run right through the heart of our reservation. And there's watersheds, there's the Bad River, there's Lake Superior, there's so many tributaries and the groundwater that can be completely decimated, impacted if one of those pipelines were to rupture or leak. We have parts of our reservation where, because of historic flooding, there are parts of the pipeline that are completely exposed to air, where there's erosion around it. And our tribe is not a wealthy tribe. We really struggle financially, and so we have invested pretty much what resources we have into fighting Enbridge and coming up with a solution that protects our waterways and for our next 7 generations. And that's something that's ongoing, and we're still battling. So I tend to share updates with Jessica LeClaire when they come up, but I hope to be able to share some good news about our pipeline situation in the future. So when we think about health equity and what might be missing when we talk about health equity, as far as, or when we start to think about protecting our land and in protecting our kinship, our language, there's some core relational determinants that are often excluded from dominant models of health equity. So much of health equity work focuses on access, behaviors, and even social determinants, but what's often missing are those deeper relational and structural dimensions. Things like land, sovereignty, which is our inherent right to self-govern, our kinship systems, our Ojibwe language, and governance are not just cultural elements, they are in and of themselves determinants of health. So when these things are disrupted through colonial processes, we see direct impacts on our safety, well-being, and healing. So if things like place, sovereignty, kinship, land, language, and shared governance are absent from health equity frameworks, Indigenous people are reduced to demographic categories rather than sovereign nations. And as we know, as tribal communities, that health equity cannot exist without sovereignty. It cannot exist without our lands. It cannot exist without governance authority. And equity must include tribal jurisdiction, infrastructure, and relational accountability. So this is an illustration from an article that um, Dr. Jess LeClaire and I published on. Seems like yesterday, but it's been a few years now. The framework of critical environmental justice nursing for planetary health. And I put this up and share this because to really fully understand planetary health, we also have to understand how environmental harms intersects with violence and structural inequities. So within this illustration, we talk about patterns of domination, such as supremacy and capitalism, patterns of violence, such as slavery, ecocide, and genocide, and patterns of health, such as despair, morbidity, and mortality. And it also addresses the health impacts of globalization through patterns of domination and violence. So this isn't something that's just specific to our country or to tribal communities in our country. This is something that impacts all communities globally. And within this framework, we also specifically addressed Indigenous, Black, post-colonial, and ecofeminist theories as foundations of this framework to exemplify the ways in which environmental injustices are often gendered, including exploitation of our Mother Earth, to illustrate human consequences of exploitation of colonized populations. So this framework really pushes us to move beyond seeing environmental issues as separate from health. And instead, it really, I think, positions nurses as key actors in environmental justice, recognizing that environmental harm is unevenly distributed and deeply tied to systems of power. And I think it also asks us to consider who is most impacted, whose knowledge counts, and who is leading the solutions. So it's kind of a segue into the work that I do as an Indigenous nurse researcher. I also identify as a survivor of violence myself. So this is a topic and a work that's deeply personal to me. Thinking about violence against Indigenous women. So this is something that I knew was prevalent within my own community and also in some of the tribal communities that I'd worked for. But when I first started my doctoral program, I honestly had no idea how incredibly widespread of an issue this was, not just in the United States and tribal communities, but also globally. So gender-based violence is a global public health crisis, and Indigenous women experience disproportionately high rates of gender-based violence. There's also a huge barrier to care that persists due to systemic racism, colonialism, and also a lack of trauma-informed and a lack of culturally safe care. So in my work as a nurse researcher that addresses this issue, I approach violence not as isolated interpersonal events, but as deeply connected to land, history, and structural conditions. And there's a growing body of Indigenous scholarship that understands violence against Indigenous women and violence against the land as interconnected, both rooted in colonial disruption and exploitation. So this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that's happened since the earliest colonial contact. We're seeing more, I think you may have been seeing more information on it. There's a lot of grassroots efforts coming from Indigenous communities that are highlighting the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. We're seeing it more on the news, but that's because our communities have felt very frustrated by being left out of the media, being left out of the data, stating that we're statistically insignificant to include within larger data sets. So that's particularly why working on this issue as a researcher is so important to me, because I feel that it's a responsibility as a tribal member to make sure that we're the ones leading this work and making sure that the work is done in the right way and that we're not perpetuating oppression in any way, that we're not using data as a weapon, but rather using it in a way to uplift our communities and empower our communities. So this is just going a little bit deeper into the land, health, and violence connection. And violence against the land is also violence against Indigenous women. So environmental harms impacts safety and well-being. And one of the ways that I highlight this in the work that I do, when we think about policies and absence of policies, and we're seeing these policies shift rapidly, even now, some of the protections that have come into place have been dismantled. Policies are changing rapidly, but energy policies have directly contributed to further land degradation, and increases of Indigenous women in US and globally has risen as a result. So, as I mentioned, there's several existing and more proposed pipeline mining projects, including in Wisconsin, but also in, sorry, cat that just won't go away. South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, all over in Canada, tar sands. And these extraction projects will have disproportionate impacts on tribal communities. So there's a lot of different reasons why that is. In order to carry out all of these really large projects, there has to be an influx of workers to be able to carry out these projects. And so in many communities, and they can be even on reservation land or on ceded territory or adjacent to reservations, they'll set up what's called man camps or temporary workers. And we have shown in data already that there are direct linkages between land degradation and extraction projects and increases in violence among Indigenous women. And this can include intimate partner violence, human trafficking, unwanted sexual experiences. And it's what's been deemed valuable within the land or under the land that's driving this. So many reservations are sitting on what colonizers feel is rich land resources. So oil, natural gas, tar sands, minerals, even water. And this clashes a lot with our inherent values. So we do not acknowledge the land as ours for the purposes of financial gain or personal gains. Our land is sacred to us because it's critically tied to our ability to carry out our traditional practices. We feel that we are the land and the land is us. And without our land, our culture weakens. So our framework, again, utilizes critical theory to understand relational pathways that challenge injustice, and also challenges the notion that non-humans are lesser being that made for profit. So I touched on a little bit about colonial determinants of health. And so in public health often focuses on individual risks such as behaviors, choices, lifestyles. But for many communities, especially for Indigenous communities, risk is structurally produced. So again, some of the things I mentioned about extraction policies, but other colonial policies like land dispossession, forced relocation, jurisdictional gaps, they continue to shape safety, access to services, and health outcomes that we see today. So beyond social determinants of health, colonial systems shape health inequities and create ongoing structural impacts. So colonial determinants of health include things like jurisdictional barriers. So Indigenous lands are considered to be sovereign, and there are really delicate relationships that exist between tribes and local government agencies. And there are also other factors like whether a state is a public law 280 state, which means that the state can intervene on tribal lands. If they're not a public law 280 state, then only tribal police, the FBI, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, US Marshals can intervene. And some tribes don't have their own tribal police, some tribes do. And so it can get really messy. And a lot of things start to fall through the cracks. And we also have really outdated policies, such as Oliphant versus Suquamish, which was a Supreme Court decision in 1978 that deemed that crimes that happen on tribal lands by a non-native cannot be prosecuted by the tribe. It has to be prosecuted by the feds. And different crimes have different rankings. There's major crimes, there's not major crimes. And so a lot of crimes fell through the cracks once that happened. Rapes went unpunished. People have gone missing. People have been trafficked with almost no repercussions. The Violence Against Women Act, The Violence Against Women Act has really done a great job of closing, excuse me, some of those loopholes. But there are loopholes that still exist. And until we can overturn that Supreme Court decision, these same things are going to keep happening. So we also see chronic underfunding of our Indigenous health services. So our Indian Health Service clinics are chronically underfunded. We have fragmented systems or siloing of services where like a DV shelter is not equipped to be able to deal with mental health or substance use issues. So people have to bounce around and go to different places. We continue to see extractive research practices, which I'll talk more about. And just a reminder that colonization is not a past event. It's something that is still happening to present day. It's embedded in our federal, state, and local policies. It's embedded in our funding structures. So if we only discuss social determinants of health, we are obscuring the root causes of disparities and inequities. And we really have to stop being afraid to point out these root causes. So one example that I think of too, when to kind of exemplify some of this is when survivors of violence are described as not seeking help or being non-compliant. But then through my research, when I was able to take a closer look, I saw a lot of barriers to help seeking, such as lack of transportation, unsafe systems, siloing of services. prior harm from institutions or providers, jurisdictional gaps. So the issue isn't necessarily people not trying to seek help, it's whether help is accessible, safe, and it's trustworthy for survivors. And this slide kind of exemplifies that a step further. So switching from that individual risk to rather looking at it through a structural violence lens. So Western public health often individualizes that risk, and Indigenous communities can sometimes be framed as hard to reach or uncooperative. But again, it's not the question of why our women are not seeking services. The question really that I'm trying to highlight through my research is that why systems remain unsafe for survivors to want to reach services. So again, just wanting to highlight the fact that structural violence shapes safety, it shapes access, and it can prevent healing. So when we individualize violence, we obscure policy failures. So using Indigenous feminism as an analytic lens, this is something that I use in my research. Indigenous feminism is not just about gender, it's about restoring balance, restoring relationality, and restoring accountability. So it centers Indigenous women's lived experience while also naming the systems. So colonialism, patriarchy, racism, and shape those experiences. So it also resists the narrative that blame individuals instead, but instead it situates harm within broader systems. So it also looks, I think one of the big pieces of it is it refuses to isolate interpersonal violence from land dispossession, economic marginalization, or jurisdictional fragmentation. And most importantly, it rejects victim blaming frameworks. Indigenous feminism insists that violence is structural, not individual, and that healing must also be structural. And using the lens of Indigenous feminism, it really researched or reshaped my research questions. Instead of why don't women leave, but rather what systems constrain safety for women. So 2I seeing is something that I use in my research as well. This is a framework that's credited to Elder Albert Marshall, and it integrates Indigenous and Western knowledge. So it's seen as additive, not additive, but rather it's transformative. So you may have heard of this framework, you may not have, but you may have heard it described as bringing together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing, but it really is more than that. It's not about adding Indigenous knowledge into existing frameworks. It's more so transforming the way that we think, what we ask, and what we value as evidence. So in clinical settings, this might look like integrating Western treatment with cultural practices identified by the patient or the community. And in research, it means allowing Indigenous perspectives to shape the questions and methods, and then not just adding them in afterwards. So in my work, personally, it fundamentally shifts whose voices are centered, especially survivors, families, and communities. So thinking through research as relational accountability. So this is a major shift from how research is traditionally done. And this is not something these are things that I did not learn as a PhD or research student. These are things that I learned from the community as I started to begin my program of research. So in traditional research ways, when we think about data extraction, whether there's relational accountability, we think, who am I accountable to? How am I showing up in a relationship with the community? And what responsibilities do I carry beyond the study itself? So to me, this includes returning knowledge back to the communities in which I um, had stories shared to me from. It's about sustaining partnerships with my communities even after my study is over, and ensuring that the work benefits the community, not just me as a researcher. So at some point, I really had to confront the fact that academic research can be extractive, even when it's well-intentioned. Um, we collect stories, we analyze them, we publish them, and then we move on, but the communities remain. And so I had to unlearn a lot. I had to unlearn extraction. I had to relearn reciprocity. And my research shifted from research subjects became partners and relatives, and from dissemination of knowledge to the return of knowledge. Um, that shift not only changed my methodology, but it also changed me as a researcher and as a human. So relational accountability requires more than just good intentions. It requires seeing things differently. And it also requires learning to hold more than one way of knowing at the same time. Storytelling as a method, storytelling is something that I use exclusively in my research with Indigenous communities. So it's often misunderstood as just a way of collecting data, but it's so much more than that. It's a relational process and a way of generating knowledge and a responsibility. So the stories that we tell, they contain context, emotion, history, and meaning in ways that traditional methods often cannot capture. And so for nurses, this directly connects to practice, how we listen to patients or relatives, how we witness, and how we respond. So as nurses, we often gather information quickly, thinking about symptoms, checklists, and timelines. But storytelling really asks us to slow down and understand the full context of someone's experience, because those stories often reveal structural barriers that wouldn't show up otherwise. And so, storytelling in Indigenous methodologies is not anecdote, it's a theory, it's data, it's shared governance. And Western academic traditions often privilege abstraction, but Indigenous knowledge systems, we understand that the meaning is carried relationally through narrative, context, and accountability. So specifically for my research program, I've shared a little bit about what I do, but more specifically, my research program centers survivor-led, community-led approaches. So this includes longstanding partnerships with tribal communities and organizations. And across different projects that I'm involved with, the goal isn't just to document barriers to help seeking, but also to co-create pathways to healing, safety, and structural change. So a few of the studies that I lead are specifically community-based participatory research or community engaged research. I'm presently collaborating with Bad River and Forest County Potawatomi tribes. I also collaborate with the Great Lakes Intertribal Council. My studies are survivor-led. I have community advisory boards in place for my studies, which often make it a little bit more challenging to move work in a way that satisfies the university requirements for tenure. But this work cannot be done without that shared governance. It's also very time consuming. I have to go through multiple levels of human subjects protections. Every tribal community has its own governance board. They may have their own IRB, or they may use tribal council, but it's very time consuming, but it's also very necessary to make sure that the work is done with the utmost care and that the tribes that I work with are benefiting from my work just as much as I am. So again, I use storytelling, and some of the things that women have shared with me, invisibility and disbelief, fear of institutions, economic dependence, lack of culturally safe services. So the things that they also shared things like economic dependence as entrapment, lack of land-based and culturally safe services. People have shared things like when they've navigated into spaces, feeling like walking into a room where no one speaks your language. I'm going to have to skip through this for sake of time, but there's a new pilot that I just started that I'm very excited about that I just wanted to share. I'm just partnering with the Lakota tribe in Wisconsin with their child support department. This is a tribally identified priority about thinking of ways of making accessing child support services safer for survivors. They feel that there's a lot of tribal members, both men and women, who are not taking advantage of child support services. And we know that economic security is one of the ways in which people are able to leave and move on and be safe when they're in unsafe situations. So I'm excited about this one, since it was the tribe who reached out and asked me to do the pilot. So I'm just about to jump into that one in a couple of weeks. So I'll share a few more slides of some other types of work that I'm doing. This is one that I've been really excited about. This is a Baldwin Idea project, restoring and awakening the cultural and ecological context of the Ojibwe Horse Society. So my community partner is the Humble Horse, and we have recorded, it's an oral history project in which we recorded stories from elders who have lived memory of the Lac La Croix Indigenous ponies. And all of the stories were recorded in Ojibwe, and they are being translated into English. And we are developing programming so we can use language revitalization, but also using the ponies themselves as a part of healing for people who've experienced trauma. So it's really about thinking that healing doesn't only occur in like counseling sessions, but it occurs on land through connection with our more than human relatives, through language revitalization, healing that occurs in connection, not isolation, and that healing that's bidirectional. So this is, I'm hoping, just the beginning of something that will be an intervention study that involves land-based healing and bidirectional healing. We are at 2:45. I think I just have a couple slides left, but I want to make sure I finish. So thinking through nursing practice implications for planetary health. So everything that I've talked about today connects directly with how we practice as nurses within a planetary health framework. So first, trauma and violence-informed care. So in planetary health, we recognize that environmental harms, displacements, and land disruptions are forms of trauma. So for Indigenous communities in particular, harm to land is inseparable from harm to people. And so trauma-informed care must expand to include ecological and historical trauma, not just from individual lived experiences. Structural and ecological awareness. So planetary health asks us to understand how environmental systems like land, water, and climate interact with social and political systems. So as nurses, this means recognizing how environmental degradation, resource extraction, and policy decisions shape our health outcomes. And so it shifts our lens from individual behavior to interconnected systems. And then third, advocacy for environmental justice. As nurses, as the largest healthcare body, we are frontline witnesses to the health impacts of environmental harm, and that our role includes advocating for policies and practices that protect both human and ecological well-being. And it also means that supporting Indigenous sovereignty and leadership, because Indigenous communities have long been leaders in environmental stewardship and relational approaches to health. Skip this one too. So planetary health action, this is something, again, that is actionable. It's not just abstract. So this can include things like advocacy, partnership, policy engagement, and we're uniquely positioned to witness and respond to these issues across settings. And people often ask me, when we have things like MMIW marches or our water walks advocating for closing down Line 5, or when the Dakota Access Pipeline was happening, things that are Indigenous specific, people have asked, well, can I be a part of that since I'm not Native? And I tell people absolutely. Indigenous peoples represent 1% to 2% of the population, so we absolutely cannot do this alone. We definitely need allies and co-conspirators in these movements. So please, if you hear of an event happening, if you want to come join, like May 5th, we have Wrap the Capitol in Red. So from noon to 4 on, I think it's Tuesday, May 5th, it's Wrap the Capitol in Red. It's a MMIW, or Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women awareness event. So you're all welcome to come and be there in solidarity with us. If you happen to live in Madison, you are more than welcome to come to that. And this is just specific to research. When I say that research, reimagining research as advocacy, as care, as healing, and as justice, not just a way to collect data and publish stuff in journals that nobody's going to read. Research really truly can be actionable, and it can be used to help heal relationships and help heal communities. And then finally, a call to action. So as you leave today, I invite you to think about how you can integrate these ideas into your own practice. It might look like centering relationships, supporting Indigenous leadership, or engaging in environmental justice work, but thinking about what small shifts in practice can contribute to larger systems change. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lupke, for that excellent presentation. Okay.
I
All
left a
right.
little bit of time for questions.
Yes. So now we will stop the recording, and folks, please feel free to come off